This video contains descriptions of mining disasters, loss of life, and historical tragedy. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine you are a miner finishing your shift. Your day's work is done. You climb aboard a small locomotive deep inside a mountain. Just a short ride to the tunnel mouth, to daylight, to home. You have done this 100 times. You know every curve of that tunnel, every sound the rock makes. And then something goes wrong. Welcome back to Golden Cattle Media, where folklore, history, and legend intertwine. Today's video drifts a little from our usual folklore territory, but only a little. Because the coal region of central Pennsylvania has its own mythology, its own ghosts, and its own stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary and often terrible moments. And as someone who grew up less than an hour from where these events took place, these stories feel personal. If that sounds like your kind of history, consider subscribing. To understand any of what follows, you first need to understand the landscape these men lived and died in. The anthracite coal fields of central Pennsylvania, stretching across Dauphin, Schuylkill, and the surrounding counties, were, for more than a century, among the most industrial significant places in North America. The black rock pulled from those mountains heated the homes of the eastern seaboard, fueled the steel mills that built American cities, and powered the railroads that stitched the country together. But it came at a cost measured in human lives. The communities of this region, Williamstown, Tower City, Hagens, Valley View, Ashland, were built around the mines. Churches rose on every corner. Polish, Lithuanian, Irish, Welsh, German, and Italian families lived in those close quarters, worshipped in their own languages, and buried their dead in the same hillside cemeteries generation after generation. The mine was not just a workplace, it was an entire shape of life. And the mountains, beautiful and ancient as they are, held dangers that no amount of skill or caution could always predict or prevent. Today, we're going to look at 3 disasters, one from 1904, one from 1977, and one from 1985, separated by decades but bound together by geography, by community, and by particular unforgiving nature of the underground work. We begin at the oldest of the 3, and in some ways, the one that still haunts me the most. May 25th, 1904. Wednesday afternoon in Bear Valley, just north of Williamstown on the Dauphin-Schuylkill County line. The shift was ending. Workers boarded a small mine locomotive, what they called a Loki, for the short ride out through the Williamstown tunnel toward daylight and home. The locomotive had been hauling timber inside the mine earlier that day. These engines ran on combustion, and in the enclosed space of a tunnel, they left behind a trail of toxic sulfurous fumes. On any other day, the ventilation would have cleared them. But on this day, the Loki derailed, jumped the tracks, and dropped several feet before reaching the tunnel mouth. The disruption was enough to trap the fumes inside. The men on board quickly began to feel the effects, and that is when the second, more tragic chapter of this story began. When word reached the town center, nearly a mile away, it spread fast. Men rushed toward the tunnel mouth without stopping to think, without waiting for proper equipment or guidance. The mine's inside foreman, M.M. Golden, led the charge. He underestimated the danger. At the south end of the tunnel, there was a canvas curtain that, if properly positioned, could have redirected the mine's ventilation and almost certainly saved lives. But it was not used. 10 men died that afternoon. M.M. Golden himself was among them, the foreman who ran in to help. So was George Radel, the master machinist, Enoch Morgan, John Kinney, Joseph Punch, Bert James, Albert Now, Henry Fredericks, Aaron Koppenhaver, and Torpus Koppenhaver. Most of those 10 were not the original victims of the fumes, most were rescuers. When the dead were finally brought out, along with nearly 40 survivors in various states of collapse, the scene at the tunnel mouth was described by witnesses as one of the most distressing things they'd ever seen. Widows, children, the entire small town of Williamstown gathered in shock. Look at those names for a moment. Morgan, Kinney, Koppenhaver, Fredericks. They represent the ethnic patchwork of the mid-Pennsylvania mines, Welsh, Irish, German. These were men shaped by a culture where toughness was a point of pride, where you did not hesitate when someone needed help. The courage that killed them was the same courage that their communities had taught them to value above almost everything else. In 1904, there was no federal mine safety authority, no formal oversight body to step in after the fact. The Great Anthracite Coal Strike of 1902 had won workers roughly half of what they asked for, but the mine operators still refused to formally recognize the United Mine Workers as their representatives. Worker safety in that moment still rested largely on the judgment of individual mine bosses, men like M.M. Golden who underestimated the danger and died for it. It would become Dauphin County's deadliest mining accident. But the mountains of central Pennsylvania were not finished. Nearly 3/4 of a century later, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, water did what fumes had done before. Porter Township, Schuylkill County. Tuesday, March 1st, 1977, shortly before noon. Porter Tunnel Mine was operated by the Kosher Coal Company, a private regional operation, not a large conglomerate. The mine itself had a history. It was originally opened in 1948 by the Reading Company, but they abandoned it after just 5 years. Kosher Coal had reopened it in 1969, and by 1977, it had an unusually clean safety record. No fatal accidents since operation began, and its most recent inspection, just 2 months earlier, had found no violations. That morning, 75 men were underground. At 11:50 a.m., in West Skidmore South Dip Conveyor Gangway section, deep inside the mountain, the water came. Old mine workings riddled the mountain above Porter Tunnel. Abandoned shafts, long sealed or simply forgotten, filled over decades with water. Nobody had mapped all of them. Nobody knew exactly how much water was sitting up there waiting. Investigators would later estimate that a reservoir had built up behind old mine walls, perhaps 60 feet high, before it finally broke through. There is no warning sign for inundation. Miners who worked with mules knew that the animals could sometimes sense an imminent roof fall or gas pocket, and that if a mule refused to enter a section, you listened. There was a long tradition of watching the mine's rats. When they ran for the exits, miners ran too. But water bursting from an old flooded workings gave no such sign. It simply arrived. Flood swept through the tunnels with tremendous force. 9 men died, 6 managed to escape through the return air emergency passage. One man, Ronald Adley, 37 of Tower City, was trapped behind a collapsed wall of rock. The 9 victims were young and middle-aged men from small Schuylkill County towns. Jerry Lee Klinger of Higgins, just 19 years old, Philip Sabatino, 50, also of Higgins, Ralph Reniger of Donaldson, Donald Schaffler of Gordon, Ronald Herb and Dennis Morgan of Valley View, Mark Crow of Good Spring, John Moyer and Timothy Gross of Ashland. These were men from communities where life had long revolved around church, family, the union hall, and the mine. Tight-knit places where everyone knew everyone and where a disaster in the mountains sent a wave of grief through entire valleys at once. Ronald Adley survived 116 hours underground, nearly 5 days, trapped in the dark behind 50 feet of collapsed rock. When rescuers finally broke through to him, his first words were not relief or gratitude. He asked them to pass him the pick hammer, and he helped finish digging his own escape route. Then he refused the stretcher. He walked the mile to the tunnel mouth himself. That detail, and I think you'll understand why, says everything about the culture these men came from. The timing of this disaster is striking when you step back and look at it. In February of 1977, just weeks before the flood, President Carter had gone on television, worn a cardigan, and told the American people that coal was the nation's salvation from the energy crisis. That shifting to domestic coal was a national priority. Porter Tunnel, an abandoned mine reopened under exactly that kind of economic pressure, was the product of this moment. And the men working in it were working in exactly the conditions that result from pushing old infrastructure harder than it was built to bear. By November of that same year, Congress had passed the Federal Mine Safety and Health Act, the most comprehensive mine safety reform in American history. 9 men drowned in Porter Township in March. A new era of mine regulation began in November. The connection is not incidental. By 1985, the coal industry in central Pennsylvania had changed almost beyond recognition. The great collieries were largely gone. What remained were small, family-tied operations, and they carried risks all their own. December 13, 1985, Williams Township, Dauphin County. The Buck Mountain Slope Mine, owned by Stephen Reha of Tower City, was a small, privately run operation. Not an industrial colliery, just a local man, a small staff, and a seam of coal in a mountain that the big operators had long since moved on from. Earl Romberger, 60 years old, was the mine foreman. A local man, On that December morning, a drill apparently angled into an unexploded blasting charge left from a previous shot. The charge detonated. Earl Romberger was killed. His son-in-law, Roger Coons, 32, of Tower City, was injured. The father-in-law and son-in-law, family. A kind of arrangement that was typical of how mining still worked in these communities by the 1980s. Not a large industrial workforce, but a trade passed down through kinship, with men working alongside the people they were related to, the people whose lives were already bound to theirs. The accident came just 2 days after 3 other miners had been killed in a methane gas explosion in Berry Township at a separate small mine. That week in December 1985 was, by any measure, a grim one across the coal region. By that point, the anthracite mining industry had been in a long, painful decline for decades. The great railroad companies that once controlled the region had stopped investing, stopped developing new markets, stopped passing their profits back into the communities that had built their fortunes. Sons no longer followed their fathers into the major operations because the major operations were largely gone. What remained were small, independent mines like Buck Mountain, running on minimal resources, often without consistent regulatory oversight. The Mine Safety and Health Administration existed by 1985, created by the same 1977 Act. But enforcement in subscale, owner-operated mines was inconsistent at best. An improvised drilling operation. An unexploded charge nobody had accounted for, a miner and his son-in-law. The old mining superstitions, the ones about mules refusing to enter shafts, about the Tommyknocker spirits the Welsh miners believed could warn you if you listened, had faded from everyday practice by 1985. But there was one folk belief that had never quite gone away, the belief in the final ship. The idea that danger was especially likely on a man's last day of work. Wives had long known this fear. They sometimes begged their husbands not to go in, especially near the end of a contract or a season. Whether Earl Romberger's family had any such premonition that morning, history does not tell us. The communities of Williams Township and Tower City, already economically depleted, already watching their younger people leave, already living in the long shadow of an industry that had taken so much and left relatively little, absorbed this loss as they absorbed all the others. The churches, which had always been the primary support structure when the mines took men, were still standing. They were often the only thing that was. These are not legendary disasters, not in the way that some of the great catastrophes of mining history are. No single event here killed hundreds. No explosion was heard for miles. They are, in a way, the ordinary disasters of the coal region, the kind that filled a column in the local paper, broke a handful of families apart, and were well largely absorbed into the quiet grief of communities that had learned over generations to expect this. That is perhaps the most honest historical note to make. From 1870 to 1913, anthracite mining in Pennsylvania killed more than 400 men a year. Most of those deaths happened 1 or 2 at a time in accidents that never made national press, in towns that urban America only thought about when it was shoveling coal into its furnaces. The stories that survived, the survivor who helped dig his own way out and refused a stretcher, the foreman who underestimated the fumes and died beside his men, the father-in-law and son-in-law, survived not because they are famous, but because someone remembered to tell them. The landscape of central Pennsylvania still bears the mark of this history if you know how to look. Old mine shafts hidden in the hills, subsidences in fields where the ground has slowly settled over collapsed workings, cemeteries on the hillsides with row after row of the same surnames. The communities are smaller now than they were in 1904 or 1977. The churches that anchored them, the Polish Catholic Church, the Welsh Methodist Chapel, the Italian parish, some are still standing, some have been consolidated or closed, the union halls are mostly gone. But the culture of stoic endurance these disasters produced, this culture that made Ronald Adley pick up a hammer and dig his own way out before refusing a stretcher, that has not disappeared. It lives in the people who still call those valleys home. What do we do with stories like these? They are not folklore exactly, they are not legend. There are no Tommyknockers tapping warnings in these tunnels, no ghosts finishing their shifts underground, though the older miners might have believed there were. What they are, I think, is testimony. Evidence that the lives of working people in small Pennsylvania towns mattered, even when the systems around them were indifferent to whether they lived or died. The 1904 disaster helped, in some small way, build the case for mine safety regulation. The 1977 disaster happened in the same year that regulation was finally overhauled. The 1985 disaster happened in the ruins of an industry that already largely abandoned the people it had been built on. The The mountains are still there, the coal is mostly gone, but the names Copenhagen, Klinger, Romberger, Adley, those names are still in those valleys, and some stories refuse to stay buried. If any of this resonates with you, whether you have roots in the coal region, an interest in labor history, or just a feeling that ordinary people deserve to be remembered, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Were any of these names familiar to you? Do you have family connections to any of these communities or mines? If you'd like to read further, I'll link sources in the description below. These stories deserve more than a YouTube video, but this is a start. Like the video if you found it worthwhile, and subscribe for more history, folklore, and the stories that tend to get left out of the official record. Until next time, history remembers the famous, folklore remembers the forgotten, and sometimes, if we're paying attention, they're the same story.